Welcome everyone to this very exciting time. We all get to listen. We all get to listen in on some of Bethany's thoughts and bright glimpses into the topic that she's chose to mull over for 2 semesters now, and that's such a privilege. I'd like to introduce you to Bethany through an email that I received from her 2 years ago already. 2 years ago, she was thinking thesis. So this email just goes to show what kind of an irrepressibly alive person we're about to hear. In June 2015, Bethany wrote, "I've known since I started my degree that I have wanted to write a thesis. I love the practice of choosing a topic that's really dear to your heart and really digging through it. I don't have an incredibly clear picture yet, but the trail I'm on right now started with my 2 final essays from my classes with you last fall." How awesome is it to hear this? Someone who wants to spend time with a topic that is dear to their heart, close to their heart. Someone who speaks with picture words. She wanted to get digging through a topic. She saw life with this topic as being on a trail and wanting to follow it in wherever it leads. She's ready for an adventure. She's curious. She wants to see where this will take her. And we get to find out how far she is along that trail. Bethany spent formative years in Southeast Asia, in Singapore. She wrote in that same email, "Singapore has in many ways donned Western regalia, and they've been criticized for it. But is this perception just symptomatic of lumping them into the larger post-colonial Southeastern Asian culture?" This is the kind of email that Bethany sent. This is the kind of question also that Bethany finds herself mulling over with great pleasure. It's been such a pleasure to work alongside Bethany, who is full of good questions dear to her heart, and so important to human relations in this world that's characterized by an overflow of difference. One of the challenges working with Bethany is that she thinks in metaphors. She's able to put 2 very different things together and see how they play with each other to get new meanings, to say different things. She gains all kinds of new meanings with that kind of metaphorical thinking. One problem that we ran into in this process is that I'm also a metaphorical thinker. So we could talk metaphors without having to unpack them. So here's one example of that conundrum. So one day, Andy and I were driving to St. John, and I was telling him about a really exciting passage from Bethany's thesis. "Do you want to hear it?" I said, "I've got it right here." I'm assuming, of course, that he really wants to hear this. It's a captive audience, of course. He has no choice. He's driving the car. I'm just sitting in the passenger seat. So I pull out my paper. It was one of those metaphors that Bethany hadn't unpacked yet. I waited eagerly for his response after I read it to him. He just turned to me with a completely blank look on his face. Okay, it struck me again. Everyone's mind doesn't work in the same way. This thing really needed to be unpacked, spelled out. We all think in different ways. And so Bethany will be unpacking her very creative metaphors in answer to the great questions that she's been asking. So Bethany, do you want to come up?
Okay, I wrote a thesis. So I want to start by reading my acknowledgement page, which I wrote 2 nights ago at like 12:30 at night. I put on Rivers and Roads to get all sentimental and then wrote all my feelings. So to Agnes, you kept me sane in the mire of these many, many words. Thank you for understanding when I answered your questions with convoluted metaphors and crab claw hand gestures. Lindsay, you'll forever be my literary theory guru, and I aspire to your syntactical prowess. Mom, thanks for lovingly reminding me of realistic scheduling needs, and for somehow always sending encouraging texts just when I need them most. Dad, thanks for paper writing solidarity and for the comfort of knowing that I do my best work at or after the last minute quirk is genetic. I'm so grateful to be the spawn of your genetics and your worldview. Holly, sorry you bore the burden of all my breakdowns. You're unbelievably patient and loving. Percy, you always understood the pain. And Neela, our years of dorm floor life chats have been integral to everything that I believe. To anyone who tried to ask me what my thesis was about, thank you for the dialogue. Thank you for the gift of being a sounding board. Sorry I probably gave you a super unsatisfactory answer. This community is a gift. My favorite color isn't blue, it's periwinkle. Because when I say periwinkle, people say, what's periwinkle? Or that's like blue, right? And then I get to explain that periwinkle is like a purpley blue in a gray sort of way. And then inevitably someone nearby will say, isn't it really kind of like mauve? And then someone asks what mauve is. When we finally Google periwinkle or mauve, we find out that even Google has 8 different ideas of what the word means. Truth be told, I don't really care that much about the bluey purpley color anymore. I just like starting arguments. And that's all besides the fact that periwinkle is a beautiful word. I like things broken, and I like breaking things. The conditions of my upbringing conspired to make me more comfortable being uncomfortable. It has developed into a firmly held principle that if you have a belief that you rely on, if you have an understanding of who you are or what you believe, and if the truth of that fact is really important to you, you should see how it would change you if it weren't true. And if that idea can break, you should smash it. You're going to have to rebuild it, but it will be stronger and truer, and you'll know the mechanics of it better once you've had to puzzle it back together. This is a difficult posture to hold. The process of smashing and rebuilding inevitably seems counterproductive. If you're aiming to have the biggest or the tallest, this is not how you will achieve that. When we're talking about what language is building, beliefs, metaphors, ideologies, culture, we must limit the constructions to the capabilities of the material. Language, the material, is fundamentally limited by the scope of each individual understanding, and by the degree to which these overlap. Language is what toppled the Tower of Babel. The workers still knew how to build a tower, but when their words no longer communicated effectively, the whole tower crumbled. We have forgotten that the legacy of Babel continues to this day. Boundaries, geographic, ethnic, religious, linguistic, are crossed more frequently and more widely today than ever before. And this reality is creating a world where it is a lot harder to believe in a unitary blue. Since the 18th century, certain Occidental bodies have met with a lot of success at believing in homogeneity, in a unitary monochromatic blue. But this is no longer possible. Le Guin describes it, quote, society in the decades around the second millennium, global, multilingual, enormously irrational, undergoing incessant radical change, is not describable in a language that assumes continuity and a common experience of life. Despite this, our communication has become simpler, faster, more distant, more abbreviated, and more competitive. Sound bites and snippets rather than dialogue and conversation. We are continuing to use language that, quote, assumes continuity and a common experience of life because of its utilitarian value for speed and efficiency in the rapid marketplace. Homogeneity is efficient. Heterogeneity is uncertain and unstable. This privileging of certain styles of language also privileges a certain variety of experience over others. It is not sustainable. We live in a heterogeneous world, as we always have, and the era where the illusion of homogeneity is feasible is now resolutely past. What is required of my posture and dialogue when I can no longer assume that my blue is your blue? How can I hold my linguistic and cultural history to make space for dialogue with this diversity of voices. So that's the first 2 pages of my introduction. And they began when Agnes, after several thesis chats, got tired of me talking about breaking, specifically in context of culture, without really being able to explain what I meant. So she sent me away and told me to write 2 pages on breaking, and I came back talking about my favorite color. To try and unpack, again, to me it makes perfect sense. The idea of the color blue, the fact that when I say my favorite color is blue, that someone else wouldn't ask, do you mean navy blue or light blue? Shows that we've gotten really comfortable with words meaning what we think they mean. We each think of a different word. When we use a word, we have a different association with the language. And that to me is where all this instability comes from. So, I wanted to take a second to unpack my title, which took me up till about a week ago to figure out. So the part I was really confident in was encountering the incomprehensible, because this whole thesis began reading a novel, Breaking the Tongue by Vivian Lowe. I read it last summer when I was thinking about my thesis, thinking about Singaporean culture, thinking about cultural formation and language and identity. And so as I was reading it, I was having this whole relationship with the book going, I understand so many of these references. I've lived in Singapore for 8 years. I understand some of this cultural identity that they're talking about, but there's also so much that I don't understand. And I wonder how much I can't even see of what I can't understand. And then on page 438 or something like that, I encountered the incomprehensible when Vivian Lowe decided to switch to Chinese at the climax of the novel. And I spent 6 years in middle school and high school Chinese classes. So I was like, challenge accepted, and I was trying to figure it out. I was like, I know some of these words, there's a comma there, and I thought I could maybe understand it, and that began this whole conversation for me of how much we can really understand in dialogue with other people, and what the ramifications of that for how we live in the world are. So the second half of my thesis title is Repository Language and Dialogue for a Heteroglossic World. And I'm going to try and explain what heteroglossia is, because that's important. So heteroglossia basically means multiple voices. And it comes from Mikhail Bakhtin's theory in relation to the novel. I'm going to really simplify this. But it's basically the existence of many languages within a single language and the variations of a unitary language. So a unitary language being what it would be like the dictionary definition of a language, as opposed to the way we actually use languages. Bakhtin says, unitary language constitutes the theoretical expression of the historical processes of linguistic unification and centralization, an expression of the centripetal forces of language. A unitary language is not something given, but is always in essence posited, and at every moment of its linguistic life it is opposed to the realities of heteroglossia. So I especially liked it because Bakhtin uses it in relation to the novel, in relation to different voices in the novel, but it's also a term that's used in relation to social contexts and people's different languages based on their social background. By heteroglossic world, I mean a world in which we can't assume that because we speak the same language, we have the same experience. A world in which we must assume heterogeneity. So in my introduction, I quoted briefly Le Guin, society in the decades around the second millennium, global, multilingual, enormously irrational, undergoing incessant radical change, is not describable in a language that assumes continuity and a common experience of life. So that to me rang really true, and that's sort of the context. The process of my thesis, which I'm going to try to briefly outline for you, traces the instability of language in the heteroglossic world through the formation and mistreatment of culture and its role as a tool of oppression, specifically in a colonial context, through to an understanding of structures of oppression and a response to oppression that is linked to our understanding of the world through the medium of language. So I'm going to read you excerpts to try and make this very non-linear 70-page document kind of make sense. So I begin by talking about language. and its ramifications. Language absorbs the memories of the people that have used them, over time accumulating cultural significance. Languages are ever developing in significant versions over long periods of time, and in daily and smaller shifts, slang, accents, or expressions. In areas where English was introduced to a cultural history in conjunction with oppression and subjugation, the nationalization of this language is a complex task. While the scar of imposing language is deep and bitter, for better or for worse, it is now part, big or small, of a narrative. The body of works created by individuals who are bringing their cultural makeup and other linguistic histories into English language works are approaching the mechanics and role of language with new criticism and insight. Vivian Lowe's Breaking the Tongue is a work of heterogeneous voices, as it both employs and questions the literary practices of the marginal and the marginalized. Breaking the Tongue follows several characters through the fall of Singapore during the Second World War, the rapid transition out of British colonial rule, and the horrors of the Japanese occupation. For Lowe, her novel is primarily about, quote, a search for national identity. But she approaches the project with a comfort with dissonance that is rarely found in the canons of national literature. The protagonist, Claude Lim, is a schoolboy in a wealthy Anglo-Chinese family during the fall of the British. Claude was raised to idolize the British. Though ethnically Chinese, his family adopted British food, clothes, and lifestyle, and only spoke English. Chinese was strictly forbidden. Claude encounters the dissonance of his cultural history and linguistic history constantly. English is his language. It is the language that he forms thoughts in, that he communicates to loved ones with, that he dreams in, but the body of associations in his language are not his cultural history. Lowe pushes against the rules of language throughout her novel. Language is the primary material with which to build and convey culture, but it is always going to lack, always going to both have limitations and be itself a limitation. Lowe takes the materials that we are given to express and build the non-concrete entities of our identity and culture and turns the building blocks on their head to highlight their insufficiency. The epigraph of Lowe's novel is a quote from President Lee Kuan Yew, who was the first president of Singapore, and it kind of shows that this is a real-life occurrence and talks about deculturalization based on language. A person who gets deculturalized, and I nearly was, so I know this danger, loses his self-confidence. He suffers from a sense of deprivation. For optimum performance, a man must know himself and the world. For optimum performance, he must know where he stands. I may speak the English language better than the Chinese language because I learned English early in life, but I will never be an Englishman in 1,000 generations, and I have not got the Western value system inside. Mine is an Eastern value system. Nevertheless, I use Western concepts, Western words, because I understand them, but I also have a different system in my mind. So once I came to this understanding of a destabilized language, which in turn destabilizes culture as something that language builds, the conversation on culture inevitably led, especially in a colonial context, to a conversation on oppression, which was chapters 3, 4, and 5 of my thesis, of how to approach oppression through dialogue. So my approach to culture. Culture is the link between the actions of an individual and the actions of the other individuals that they interact with. It is what they internalize from their predecessors, share with their contemporaries, and will pass on to their offspring. And at the same time, culture is a fragmented, wavering entity. It both inhabits and transcends specific times and places. It exists on a grand level as a unifying force more than the individual, but almost more importantly, it originates in the ever-changing experience of a person. The synergistic product of these many experiences is only greater than the individual because its reliance on so many constantly changing perspectives makes it fundamentally unstable. Cultural theorist Edward Said observed that when culture stagnates or plateaus, it becomes ideology. It is new, quote, "It is new and other experiences that keep culture from freezing into a hard set of doctrines. Culture is culture when it is renewed, reinterpreted, relived. The death of culture is literalism. That is, the practice of turning tradition and history into orthodoxy and authoritarianism." To me, it's an understanding of language as something solid that we can use to build things that allows us to think of a culture which can become something hard. And when culture becomes something solid that we try to stand on, it inevitably turns into ideology, orthodoxy, and authoritarianism. So to approach this, I started thinking about the ideas of Paulo Freire, who I think a lot of people here are familiar with. And he really opened up my view of how structures of repression work. And he talked a lot about dialogue and words and the importance of language to countering the structure of repression. So this section would be humanizing naming dialogue. I had section headings, and then they're not here now. So, just so you know. So humanizing naming dialogue. Freire paints a world in which every human's, quote, ontological vocation, end quote, which means the calling that comes out of the fact of their very physical existence, is to become more fully human, to be fully humanized by speaking true words about the world they live in, which is best done in dialogue with those around them. This is not merely a verbal dialogue, but a dialogue of two equal parties collaborating in order to dialectically better understand their world. Without this generous posture that is seeking a truly equal stance, this dialogue would not work. For Freire, the word is the core element of dialogue, and the word is two-dimensional, composed of, quote, reflection and action. If the word that we speak does not have an element of action, then we lull back into what he calls mere verbalism. Quote, to exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. Once named, the world in its turn reappears to the namer as a problem and requires of them a new naming. Human beings are not built in silence, but in word, in work, in action reflection. Humans can only name, end quote, humans can only name the world in dialogue with others, dialectically and actively dancing around the apparition of the world. To me, this idea of a process has been fundamental to what it means to be in dialogue, that we're not reaching for a conclusion, we're looking to be part of a process. And that process, what Freire calls man in the process of liberation, is how we become more humanized. Two other important concepts from him are the idea of limit situations. The historical nature of human beings means that we inherit a position that is already oppressive or oppressed in some degree. When we imagine our position on the greater scale of privilege and oppression to be only influenced by our lifetime and our decisions, we embrace a significant and dangerous ignorance. He also goes on to talk about how in this humanizing dialogue, only the oppressed can be the ones to initiate that humanization, though it is humanizing to both. Quote, although the situation of oppression is a dehumanized and dehumanizing totality, affecting both the oppressors and those whom they oppress, it is the latter who must, from their stifled humanity, wage for both the struggle for a fuller humanity. The oppressor, who is himself dehumanized because he dehumanizes others, is unable to lead this struggle. From here, I want to talk a bit about how this plays out in the novel. Specifically, in relation to an idea by Albert Camus, which I call The Rebels Know. After the fall of Singapore, the novel centers on a trio of characters living in the Japanese-occupied war zone. There's Jack, a white British national who has just recently moved to Singapore, Ling Li, a female Chinese nationalist Singaporean, and Claude, an anglicized Chinese Singaporean who emulates the British. The interaction between the three characters plays out the oppressor-oppressed dialogue on several levels. From the interaction of these characters, I began to better understand humanizing dialogue that originates from the oppressed. In particular, I compared the two colonized characters, Claude and Ling Li. Claude was raised to try to succeed in the British system and was only allowed to speak English. He wasn't allowed to explore the parameters of his culture and language, as Said said, to renew, reinterpret, and relive it. Ling Li, on the other hand, has been resisting the systemic trauma of colonial oppression from the beginning, as she has been resisting other layers of repression in her life. And thus she is prepared to speak up and fight when her world turns into a war zone. Claude is not so equipped. It is not a coincidence that she is multilingual, speaking English, Chinese, and several other dialects, while Claude has been restricted to just English. I picked up The Rebel by Albert Camus in the bookstore in Calais, kind of on a whim, like maybe this will have something to do with my thesis. And I was rereading it as I was rereading parts of Breaking the Tongue. And through serendipity, I had these two sections of the two different novels that really spoke together. Camus' definition of a rebel to me articulates the posture that is necessary for entering humanizing dialogue. And so in this quote, This quote is from the beginning of Breaking the Tongue, Claude before the fall of Singapore, when he is profoundly dehumanized because he doesn't have access to his cultural history. So my thesis, they go beside each other like this. Claude mutters, "Yes, sir," even as he wants to say rudely, "No bloody way." He knows he will never say "no bloody way" to his father, not out of some sense of what his father might do to him if he did, but because he is too afraid to say no to anyone. For if he ever did say "no bloody way," he would then have to come up with a sense of indignation and assert his own preferences, and he is too unsure of himself to assert anything, or worse, to have anything at all to assert. Camus says, "What is a rebel? A man who says no, but whose refusal does not imply a renunciation. By saying no, he means, for example, that this has been going on too long. Up to this point, yes, beyond it, no. You are going too far, or again, there is a limit beyond which you shall not go." In other words, his no affirms the existence of a borderline. Rebellion cannot exist without the feeling that somewhere and somehow one is right. In The Rebel, Albert Camus distinguishes between rebellion and revolution. In the work's foreword, Herbert Reed summates, "Here, and not for the first time, Camus' ideas come close to anarchism, for he recognizes that revolution always implies the establishment of a new government, whereas rebellion is action without planned issue. It is spontaneous protestation." Camus' rebellion, similar to Freire's process, dances intentionally around a final conclusion that would inevitably atrophy and stagnate. In the first chapter, Camus defines the attitude and person of a rebel as a man who says no. This definition is notable not because the rebel says no, but because his no does not necessitate a counter-argument or a rationalized disputation. A rebel is not a man who eloquently articulates his negative position, a man who establishes his no in a court of law, or the man who convinces the majority of the validity of his no. It only requires one word and some self-confidence. The rebel is the man who can contradict and begin a conversation. The no stirs the pot, it questions, it humanizes, it begins man in the process of liberation. The rebel's no suggests a gradient by opposing a unitary monochromatic blue. Rebellion cannot occur when men believe that they are dealing in undeniable facts. A rebel must be able to recognize, quote, that there is something in him which is worthwhile and which must be taken into consideration. Camus. The staple of oppression is a mindset that says that everyone has a seat at the table if they can play the game whose rules are made by those who are already at the top and which are made to grease the ladder. Rebellion is not learning to play the game better, but to be able to say, "No, this is not fair, that is not true," even before you can articulate why. This sense of offended justice and indignation must be recognized as a fact and reality that is not inferior to whatever logic or perceived fact of society is offending it. So now I want to go into a little bit of how I think the novel plays out this no. And I had this quote on the screen, it's not there anymore, I wish it was. Claude Lingley says, "Jack can afford to close his eyes. He can afford to turn away. In a few years it will be over and he will return to his country, glad and relieved to be home at last. He will be able to put his memories behind him, especially things he did not see. It will be as if they never existed. He and others like him will be able to convince themselves of that." Her voice changes, becomes melodious. "Danchini Jobu Tonga," she says. "You're different. You have no other home but here. Ni Xianzai Ingai Jida." The novel, properly employed, is a crucial player in portraying this ideal state of rebellion. To read is to listen to another human's naming of the world. It is an egalitarian dialogue between reader and author, reader and character, character and character, the heteroglossia of the novel. The fictional novel is a gentle but firm way to say no to the existing order, to the reader's existing perception. The author says to the reader, up to this point, yes, but beyond it, no. There is something different, something other, something beyond your understanding. When Lo switches to Chinese ideograms, she says no to many readers. You might understand some of what I am saying, you may try to understand, but I will not limit my articulation to fit your ability to understand. She reminds the reader that he or she is not a god, even and perhaps especially in the world of fiction, but really in any world where language builds dialogue. Yes, part of the narrative written in Chinese is inaccessible to many, but comprehension is not so black and white. We understand all text through our cultural currency as much as through our linguistic currency. We may speak the same words as Vivian Lowe or Claude Lim, but do we understand what it is to live in wartime? To be a pubescent boy? To exist in a liminal space between two cultures that won't accept you? To powerlessly watch the suffering of another human being? The nature of dialogue is always fragmented, always a new creation, not a gleaming dossier of plot passed from author to reader, or conversationalist to conversationalist. The reader may not be able to read all of the words with which Vivian Lowe finishes her story, but that does not make the words less a part of the dialogue. The words are a reminder that the author and the characters do not owe it to the reader to present themselves in an understandable, consumable way. Nor could they, nor could anyone. And perhaps they are not so incomprehensible as they might at first seem. What do we know from the punctuation, the syntax, the spacing? Try to have it read to you. What is there in the voice? How much can we infer from the blips of English interspersed? Stare at the ideograms themselves. Try to imagine. Each of these symbols carries the weight of the experience of millions of humans. These words are the material of another person's experience as your words are the material of yours. Early in the novel, when Claude first sees Chinese characters that his grandmother shows him, he has a conversation with her. He says, "How does it work? Is this a verb, a noun?" She says, "It's a world, just like every word, every character, an image of the world." He squints at the neatly brush-painted worlds, turns the paper scraps upside down, then writes it up again. "All depends on memory," she says. "You start by memorizing brush strokes, by memorizing stroke combinations, by committing the world to memory and then reproducing it one world at a time." "Teach me," he says again. This posture does not just apply to a different language. How can we read English as the incomprehensible, as we become more aware of the disparate experiences of our heteroglossal worlds? How can we posture ourselves humbly to understand in someone else's context? When someone says no but can't articulate to us a renunciation, how far will we go to make space for them to be able to articulate it? How far will we go to find a way to understand? I want to end with a bit from the end of the novel, just kind of magic realism. It's the description of Claude breaking his tongue. "And then, in a flash, there is a release, and you are holding the fleshy red organ in your hand. It is heavy, warm, and still quivering. You experience a brief nostalgia, but you shake it off. There is no further use for the tongue, and it will soon rot. You toss it as far as you can, and it lands in a splash of unseen water. Your mouth is burning. Every so often you spit out blood, but there is a novel lightness and spaciousness within. You test your speech. Only a moaning sound. Louder, a gurgle, a wail. Nonsense syllables. The building blocks of new speech. When fully healed, you will have only a stub to work with. No miraculous new tongue will sprout in the old one's place. No regeneration of what has been lost. Only a muteness, at best a stunted form of speech, that will make children laugh and tease you mercilessly. No matter, you will laugh along, knowing that they will not be contaminated by that old tongue. In your hand, your clarinet appears. You bring it to your lips and play a simple melodic line, then stop and hum it. Clarinet and human voice, pure instruments. You have ventured past words." That's all. Yes.
So that last quote you read, that was Claude?
Yeah, that was Claude.
So he cut his own tongue out, or did I miss that?
Yeah. Sorry. So Claude, throughout the whole novel, has night terrors about having his tongue cut out, and in some of them, someone else is cutting out his tongue. In some of them, he's cutting out his own tongue, or there's like a bunch of claws around him cutting out his tongue, and he's like fighting them, and it's this like really traumatic thing. And then at the end of the novel, in a sort of like dream state, he asks the other Claudes for the scissors and cuts out his own tongue, just to stop the struggle. And yeah.
So in terms of that quote that's up there, would it be fair to say that he cuts his own tongue out so as, not metaphorically now, to have the ability to say no?
Yeah, I think To me, it's connected to so much I didn't explain. The part in Chinese at the end, he learns Chinese after Lingli dies, and then is called back into this vision dream state to see Lingli's death, which he didn't actually experience. And Lingli, so they're disembodied spirits, she says, "You have to come into this and name it with me." And then, so the part in Chinese is a joint bilingual dialogue that they both say together so that he can witness for her this trauma that she went through. And so for me, he cuts out his tongue as a way to let go of that power, because for so long he's tried to play the power system to, speak the right language so that he's the most competent, the most capable, trying to have the most power. And so his willingness to not even be able to speak shows that he's learned what it is to listen. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. We'll talk later.
Okay. Yes.
So, if I understand right, the reposturing of language for a heteroglossic world, that's like that's the flattening of the hierarchy, in terms of something like English or whatever not being the thing around which things orbit. Is that right?
Yes. I think the important part to me is the re in reposturing. So I talk a bit about the goal not so much to be flattening the hierarchy, but to be understanding your place on the hierarchy, and learning how to speak as the oppressed into the situations where you're oppressed, and to listen in situations where you're an oppressor. So I don't really agree with the whole oppressed-oppressor binary. I think that everyone is kind of the scale. So reposturing is learning where you're trying to hold a posture of power, and learning how, because of the flaws in our ability to dialogue, we need to hold that loosely and lightly and humbly, and just that constant renewal, reprocess, dialoguing and deconstructing.
Great. And then if I can do a follow-up, just
Yeah.
quick, because what I wanted to ask was about that dialogue.
Yeah.
Actually, because obviously it's a short presentation of a huge, amazing work. So I was just curious about how you would characterize dialogue functioning helpfully in this reposturing. Like, what is this thing? Is it just a regular dialectic in which things get milled through, or it seems like there's something else going on? for you?
Yeah. Can I read the first couple sentences of my chapter 1? So chapter 1 is called Dialoguing and Deconstructing Symbiotic, Centripetal, and Centrifugal Forces. So basically it's the idea that in dialogue, you're bringing things together, but you're also, so you're together creating an understanding, a center to stand on, but when you're being exposed to new language, you're also having your understanding broadened. So it's that like simultaneous in and out. And so that's my abstract. So my first words are, here. The invaluable utility of language is in its simultaneous potential for specificity and inexhaustible breadth. There is no resolute word, there is only the allure of it. There is no statement whose worth exists independent of its context. There is no moment where further clarification is unwarranted, irrelevant, or even unnecessary. So for me, dialogue is understanding that there is no point where you've understood, where you can't benefit from having more dialogue. So it's just being aware that there isn't an end goal and not working towards an end goal, but working towards a process of naming the world dialectically together. Yeah.
I guess sort of building on that, you mentioned just now that I guess like sort of there's one like within this kind of oppressor-oppressed binary or whatever, there's the side that's trying to speak and sort of allowing them to speak, and the other side sort of listening. But it seems like you're maybe kind of suggesting something like more of like the listening is sort of passive, I guess. It sounds like you're suggesting something more active as well in like in the cutting out of the tongue.
Yeah.
Sort of like, 'cause I think it's, you know, this whole like oppressed side of it seems very tied to Western rational sort of discourse or whatever. So is there some part of it that's kind of like, I guess, lessening yourself, or like, not lessening yourself, but like inhibiting yourself to some extent or whatever, in order to listen better or whatever? Like it seems like it's more of like an active thing than just listening.
Yeah, oh,
But,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the emphasis is on the reposturing. So it's not just listening, it's dialoguing, but it's understanding how you're coming into the dialogue. So by no means it's just a thing of like sit down and shut up. I had a lot of times, like whole weeks, where I was like, I can't write this thesis, I can't write a monologue about dialogue, I'm the oppressor, why am I saying this? Yeah. But trying to understand, also because I don't think it's a binary. So understanding that you have a context in which you're not the oppressor, in which you're the oppressed, and understanding what that feels like and how you dialogue there, and then bring that to conversations where you are being oppressive, potentially, to continue that dialogue. And also, I mean, I talk about this in a colonial context, but I think this posture is really, it's universal. The idea, we are never in a homogeneous world. Every context is heteroglossic.
Right.
So this context here, like, in every dialogue, holding yourself like this, and not just where you're like, oh, we're like different ethnicities.
Right. So a lot of it has to do with sort of recognizing your position and sort of proceeding.
Yeah, just being willing to, if you have an idea that you really believe in, being willing to think how it would change you if it weren't true.
Right.
That's, yeah. Yes.
So this might sound like a stretch, but I'm struck by the way in which what you're talking about sounds remarkably analogous to narrative therapy that Stephanie talked about yesterday morning. And that the whole choreography of deconstructing and reconstructing, and that they're not even separate processes at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just find that pretty amazing. But the part that I want to particularly ask about it is it strikes me partly in the final the magical reality part of the breaking of the tongue. It's like, how do you do that unless you somehow have this crazy trust in the stub of a tongue or in the muteness? Like the faith that's involved in the deconstruction seems striking. Like, how would you see that?
Yeah, I see that as the Edward Said quote about culture stagnating. I think that we think that it's better to have something solid, it's better to have a tongue and be competent and have a culture that we can stand on and to sort of understand the world, but the idea that if we're not reliving and reinterpreting, we've stagnated and it's just become ideology. And so I think that magical realist part at the end is kind of saying that it's better to be without the ability to speak, but to be in the process of trying to understand, than to think that you have it all together. And that's a more human dialogue. You're more capable of naming the world and to be in that process of liberation, than if you're like, well, but I need my tongue to talk, because I'm smart. Also, Lauren was telling me about her narrative therapy course a couple of months ago, and I was like, that sounds a lot like my thesis, but psychology's scary, so.
And this isn't scary?
I think it's a little scary.
Kind of just adding to that, my thought as you were talking, Walter, was that it sounds like from the story, as much as you've given us, it also takes maybe reaching a certain point of, like, there's no turning back to need to take that leap of faith. Like, I don't know if this will be what I think it will be, but I do know that, and even kind of that rebellion idea, like, rebellion cannot exist without the feeling that somewhere and somehow one is right. It's kind of like, well, I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't go back to where I was, so I'm gonna cut off my tongue, kind of.
Yeah, to be able to say no into a context, even if you don't really understand why, but to say, something isn't right here, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
But that's, rift in relationships, it's a scary thing. Yes, Agnes?
I wonder if it would be helpful to talk about how Claude came to see that the tongue he had was completely not working well. he was kind of mute with that tongue.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So
It's almost like Joy's thesis last year, where she talked about God is dead, and it was like her image of God is dead, and how she discovered that, and she needed to acknowledge that. I don't know.
yeah, I'm not sure exactly which part, but all throughout the book, you kind of see Claude, like every once in a while, he'll be like, she'll just make little like linguistic connections, like, oh, dessert. I'd like to dessert the table right now. And he'd like all these little like, or like he'll talk about the Latin root of a word that like I don't know. And he's just like, he can dig so far into these words, but it's just verbalism. It's just, there's no action to his words.
Because it's English.
Because
right?
it's English, yeah. Because somehow he's limited. He's not able to wallow and revel in these words. Yeah. Doug?
I really enjoyed the way in which you seem not just to be comfortable with, but to long for a heteroglossic world, that sense of diversity and this comfort with the questions rather than the answers. I was curious though, you referenced the Tower of Babel and the actions, the loss of, or the entrance into heteroglossia in a sense, but and you know, Camus, the vision of the rebel, Camus lives in a world which is profoundly absent of God.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question in that struggle for healthy living in a heteroglossic world, you know, doesn't that put God in the position of being the oppressor? I mean, even in the Tower of Babel, isn't he the one, or what is God's role then in this pursuit, in that story?
Yeah.
And Camus talks about naming, and I think, or no, it's Paulo Freire talks about naming, but
Yeah.
it's, you know, one of the roles of God is to give us the capacity to name. Is that an oppressive role or not?
Yeah. So that the rebel, the beginning and the end, I loved. The middle was all like nihilistic, and I was like, I don't really know what's happening here. But the end also talks about religion, so I'm going to show you that book later. But I think my response to that would be that language, or that dialogue is supposed to be, the dialogue is humanizing. And I think that God wants us to be fully human, and that's why he did the whole Babel thing, right? He was like, you're not gods. Camus says, in dialogue, we tell each other, you're not a god. You're limited. Under the sun, you're limited. And so I think if anyone has the right to have a lot of power and not be an oppressor, I hope it's God. That's the God that I know, hopefully. But I think that's why he, gave us all these different languages. He said, don't try and be bigger than you are, just talk to each other. Just wallow in your existence. You're not gods. Enjoy it. You left?
The passage you were reading about, like taking out like the fleshy tongue out of your mouth, well, it just reminded me of any organ. It like sounded like someone ripping their heart out. Actually, Tyrell wrote a story once where someone has to rip their heart out of their own chest. It reminded me of that. And I was thinking though about the passage in Isaiah where God says that, I'll take your heart of stone and I'll give you a heart of flesh. And it sounds like, I don't know, like from your perspective, he's saying, I will take your tongue of flesh and I'll give you a clear neck. Yeah, it's like translating, or that idea of it being so as irreversible, taking out your tongue as taking out your heart. It's like like the existentialist, like suicide or leap of faith, and the idea of it being essentially the same thing, almost in this case, just as irreversible.
Yeah. Maybe Claude's tongue had turned into stone, and so you didn't have the option of a tongue of flesh. Yes, Andy?
I'm just wondering if the dream sequence about taking his tongue, doesn't that also have something to do with the fact that he was held captive by the Japanese and they tried to force him to talk, and he wished then that he didn't have a tongue?
Yeah.
And also, I'm just wondering if by the end of the book that Claude Lim would have anything at all to assert.
Okay, two-part question. So the beginning, there's a lot about the reliability of the narrator, which I went into this whole thing about like fiction versus historical fiction, which Agnes and I had a lot of. I was like, Ursula Le Guin, she's so important in fantasy. But yeah, the whole story is told from Claude being tortured by the Japanese. So in the first couple chapters, there's parts where he's like, I can make history, like I'm not gonna tell you. And there's times when he's telling us about Ling Li's childhood and he's like, oh wait, I don't know that. How'd I know that? I don't know. And so the whole thing of like, it's a historical fiction novel, but yeah, she doesn't want you to think that this is a real experience. The second part was anything to assert.
Yeah, by the end of the
Yeah.
book, do you think Claude Lim had anything at all to assert?
Yeah. I don't.
Because he did change.
Yeah, I think the idea is that he didn't say no because he didn't have anything to assert, and I think at the end he's comfortable with not having anything to assert, and I think that's the real growth. Is that he's comfortable with being broken and with being incapable, and so he's a human, and maybe then he'll be able to learn how to assert with his clarinet. There's also a whole conversation on like feminism and how he relates to women, which I didn't want to go into, but I think that would be kind of where a lot of his growth is. Phyllis?
Well, I speculate that if there were a sequel to the novel, that he would wish for his tongue back.
Why?
Oh, well, I haven't figured that out.
Oh. Fun fact.
No, I have a partial answer, because I think he sees his tongue as an instrument of oppression. And I think in a sense we see language in that way, but ultimately I don't think it is. If we could strip it away, if we could strip it down to being no language, we would still have oppression.
Yeah.
So I think he would come to a point where he sees something more clearly, but could no longer articulate it.
Yeah, I think it's not meant to be taken literally. I think it's definitely a metaphor, and a lot of the importance I think is because for so long he was so protective of his tongue. He could only speak English. He was like strictly forbidden to speak Chinese, and so he just now has a looseness with the tongue. And because there was this violence, he was having these night terrors, and so a lot of his life was just postured around protecting his tongue. And he was like, because of all that aggressive context that he was in, he eventually had to say, I'd rather lose the tongue. But I don't think that he's advocating for, muteness. Just fun fact, this is the only novel that Vivian Lowe has written, and she's also a doctor. That's like her day job, and she dances on the side because she's really cool. Yeah.
So then, in some ways, like, the ripping out the tongue is this huge symbol, and I think, I haven't read it, but what I'm hearing is its violence is necessary for the character to develop. Like it's not a literal thing. It's this symbol but in order to make it concrete for Claude, it has to be that visceral and violent to actually symbolize that letting go of that.
Yeah. I think quickly, there's this triad of the three, Jack, Claude, and Ling Li, and Claude is interesting because he's kind of the oppressor, but also kind of the oppressed. He's sort of in between, and so I think it's less about learning how to talk as an oppressed, as that's actually about his posture as an oppressor to Ling Li, in relation to like feminism and how he sees the world and how he's interacted with the world before. And so there is a degree of violence that's just him doing what he needs to do to be able to hear her voice and to be with her in her situation of oppression. Yes.
For the sake of dialogue, it would seem that perhaps in cutting out the tongue, replacing it with a clarinet, is simply searching for something more. It's still expressing language. Music is a universal language.
Yeah.
Still the desire to express, still the desire to be in communion. It seems that there might be an inherent danger in that self-mutilation actually makes oneself one's own oppressor, and trying to free oneself from something that is fundamentally human, which is the ability to be in communion and communicate. You mentioned, and just throwing a few ideas out there, but in response to the Tower of Babel, where there's all of a sudden a multiplicity of languages, which is not really a problem, it is a problem, but rather a consequence for our alienation from God in the garden. And if God is going to be an equation, then I wonder if we should look at what is the solution that's proposed, and there's two things that come to mind. particularly in this season, the Christian tradition, we stand in between Easter and Pentecost. That the Word become flesh to dwell among us may be God's response to reestablishing communion. And that Pentecost is actually the answer to what happened at the Tower of Babel. That it wasn't moving the tongue, but actually speaking in boldness and in freedom, in communion with God, that all might come to deeper understanding regardless of the language that one speaks. And there's something that transcends our human experience. At the Tower of Babel, the naming that was important, our ability to name, which is a gift given by God. In the Hebrew tradition, mankind saying to himself, let us make a name for ourselves, Hashem, for ourselves, which is what brought about the building of the tower and ultimately the multiplicity of languages. We again further alienate ourselves from that which is fundamental to our being human, which is that we are a creature. Just some thoughts for Dr.
Yeah. I do kind of want to respond. In the first part, I think what you were saying about the clarinet being beyond words, I think that's a big part of it, is that I don't think he has oppressed himself by removing his words, because he's still searching for dialogue and he's still looking to be in communion. He's just making it more difficult for himself, so he's more aware of that of how they're interacting. And I think to some extent, challenging yourself to dialogue through a medium that you're not used to is really important. Trying to speak in a different language, trying to speak across a cultural barrier. And then the second part was really long, but yeah, the idea of Pentecost and the multiplicity of tongues, I think, dialogue that is out there. I think that God really wants us to be dialoguing with people beyond our context. And I think that far after Babel, maybe we got really comfortable with the communities of people that spoke the same language as us. Because at Babel, there was all these different languages, and then we all kind of grouped off. And I think maybe Pentecost was him stirring the pot again and saying, go find out about a different cultural language. You've become too focused on the little groups of your linguistic language.
Any more questions?
Mom, did you ever?
I just had one. I just wondered if there's a difference between a verbal conversation and a written one. I mean, Claude can still write, he can still share his experience.
Yeah. I think I do talk about like the role of the novel and impression, and I think there's a difference. I think they're both words and language, and you can still write.